21st chapter of Numbers. From Mount Hor, the Israelites set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness, where there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food?" Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole, and whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent made of bronze and live. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So probably many of you have seen the Indiana Jones movies, where Harrison Ford plays the adventurer Indiana Jones, who is absolutely fearless about pretty much everything except for snakes. So there's a running joke throughout the movies. Whenever a snake shows up, Indiana Jones goes, "I hate snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?" And me and Indiana Jones, we are like this on snakes. Because even though I have never been bitten by a snake, somehow for me, I don't want to hold the snake. I don't want to pet the snake. Even seeing the snake slither across in front of me just gives me the creeps, and I go, "Ooh!" I don't want the snake around. I don't want to be reminded if the snake is around. And so I can also fully relate to the ancient Israelites who told Moses, "Really, pray to the Lord. Tell him, take away the snakes. We're tired of the snakes." They were tired of the snakes. They were tired of being bitten. They were tired of the pain and the suffering. They were tired of being reminded in the presence of the snakes that they had done something that maybe they shouldn't have done. They were just tired of dealing with the snakes. So they asked Moses, "Pray to the Lord to take away the snakes." So Moses prayed to the Lord. And God heard. And God helped them. And God had mercy on them. But did you notice that God did not do what Moses and the people asked? He didn't actually take away the snakes. The snakes were apparently still there. And they were still biting people, because otherwise there would be no purpose in making the serpent of bronze, putting it on a pole, and having that be the antidote for when, not if, someone was bitten by a snake. That's not the way I would want the story to go. Sure, it's not the way the ancient Israelites wanted the story to go. I would much prefer, especially as we get near St. Patrick's Day, for the story to go more like the story of St. Patrick. You know, there's a story, there's a legend about Patrick when he was the missionary to Ireland. He went into Ireland and raised his hands like Moses parting the Red Sea, and apparently drove all the snakes out of Ireland. The snakes were gone. Now, archaeologists and historians tell us that there's really no evidence that there were ever snakes in Ireland, but it's a great story. And in any event, the snakes are gone. There are no snakes. But in this snake story, the snakes stay. God did not take away the snakes, at least not immediately. And God also did not immediately take away the suffering or the pain. And God did not promise that nobody else would ever be bitten. But God did offer hope. God did offer healing. And most importantly, God offered a way to endure the pain and suffering so that the people could keep on moving towards the promised land, which was, after all, the reason that they were wandering around in this desert full of snakes anyway. They were on a journey. They were going to a place that God had promised them, and God was going to make it possible for them to continue on to that place of promise that God had in mind for them. So the story, for us, kind of is a question. And this is the question. What is the snake in your life? What's the snake? What is it that really scares you? What is it that has hurt you or somebody you love very deeply? What is it that continues to infest your life, sap your energy and attention, and maybe bite you when you least expect it. What's the snake? Whatever it is, if you're like me, and maybe like the ancient Israelites, you probably also have said in your prayers at some point, God, please take away the snake. Make it go away. I don't want to be bitten by it. I don't want to be reminded of it. I don't want it infesting my life and sapping my energy and my attention. Because after a while, it's really hard to keep dealing with the snakes. And you just want God to make the snake go away. You don't want it to still be there, or keep showing up, or bite you when you least expect it. And sometimes, we're probably tempted to think that if the snake does not go away, God somehow isn't listening, or God doesn't care. Why is this snake still infecting my life? But maybe like those ancient Israelites, instead of continually demanding that God take away the snakes out of our lives, instead we should be looking for the ways that God is providing to us hope and healing and a way forward, in spite of the snakes. That is, maybe like those ancient Israelites, the answer from God is not to simply magically take away all the snakes out of our lives so that everything is fine and we never have any problems. But rather, even when we have those problems, even when we have those things infesting our lives, even when we feel bitten, maybe healing and hope and a way forward comes through simple things like simply naming and recognizing the stakes that are hurting us. And that's the first sort of interesting and kind of bizarre thing about this story of Moses putting the serpent on a pole. If I get bitten by a snake, the last thing I want to do is look at a snake. I want to run off and hide from it someplace. I don't want to see it or think about it. But even though, the Nile is a river in Egypt, it's mentioned in the Bible, the Nile doesn't work so well, right? And so the first part of healing and wholeness that God offers to the people is when people are actually able to look at the thing that they're scared of, the thing that's hurt them, and name it, and confess it. And that's the first way that God offers them a way forward. People interpreted the snakes as a sign of God's disfavor, as a sign of God's punishment. And by actually looking at the snake and saying, yep, there's a snake, it was a way of essentially confessing to God, yeah, I did something wrong, I got myself in a problem. And that was the sign of healing, God's forgiveness, God's help. God's promise that even when you're bitten by the snake, that's not going to be the end of you. That's what the snake was all about. It was about naming that, owning it. And sometimes that's the most important thing for us. So many people, when they have a really difficult situation in their life, they want to kind of go off and hide until they fix it themselves. And then they can come out and talk to other people and pretend it didn't happen. But from the very beginning, that's not the way God says it works for us. Name it, own it, and that's the first part of healing. And as they named it and as they owned it, they did it as a community. The people were called together to look at this serpent on the pole. They weren't told to go off to some retreat center someplace, some high mountain apart from everybody else and privately confess this. They were called to come together. And often God's healing and God's help, and the way that God gives us a way forward, is instead of trying to handle stuff just by ourselves, it happens when we deal with the snake bites in the community of faith that God gives us. And it's often the case, and I'm really glad for this here at Prince of Peace, that people have come here, or people who are here anyway, and said, I had this really terrible snake bite in my life. It was something physical, or emotional, or spiritual. And I was having difficulty with it, and it was this community through which God helped me to deal with it. And there's no magical thing usually people say. It wasn't like somebody told me the exact Bible verse I needed to read for that. It was just that people were there for me. They sat with me. They cried with me. They held my hand. They invited me to dinner or coffee or something like that. And people were there. They were God. They were the physical sign of God's presence in my life of something that was not the snake. And that's what gave me help and healing and wholeness to move forward. And then, if you've got that help and healing, you can start to focus on something that is not the snake. And that ultimately was what God called people to do when they looked at the bronze serpent. You look at the snake, you're not going to die. So now what? Now you don't have to focus on the snakes anymore. Now you can get refocused on the journey and going to the place that God has called you to go. To be on that traveling journey towards that promised land. That was the purpose of lifting up the serpent on the pole so that you could get beyond the snake. And that's why Jesus, I think, picks this up in the gospel reading. When he says, Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up on the cross. So, we put crosses all over the church. And the point of the cross also is not so that we can focus on suffering and death and how horrible it was for Jesus, but rather to see in the cross a sign that God has life and hope and promise for us beyond death. That even our own death is not the end of the journey. Jesus calls us to be people who, in spite of the snake bites in our lives, recognize that God has a bigger journey for us. God has more in mind for us. And in lifting up sometimes the snakes, it's the ability to say, you know what, the snake is not the end. It's not all there is. Let's keep on with the journey. Because frankly, in one way or another, there's always going to be snakes in our lives. God never promised that there would not be snakes, and he doesn't promise to make them go away, at least not according to our schedule. But especially in Jesus, God promises us strength to endure all the snakes in our lives. God promises us hope that the future is not finally determined by the snakes. And most of all, God promises us healing and new life in Jesus, which assures us that no snake bite, not even the snake bite of death, is going to separate us from God's love and God's promised future of life and healing